Thank you all for sharing some of your perspective. Got a lot of papers. When we went on this trip, one of the first things we discussed was values. And the first one I talked about was Dina de Malchuta Dina. The law of the land is the law. It was the very first principle. And it's a law that isn't often cited in more liberal aspects of Judaism. In some ways, it's taken for granted, even though it is, in fact, one of the only sort of extragenous laws in halakha. Right? It comes from outside. Liberal Jews have historically focused instead on the prophetic tradition and not halakha, but I wanted to highlight that the origins of this idea, the law of the land is the law, come from Jeremiah's letter to the Babylonian exiles in Jeremiah 29:7. In our time, this is an uncomfortable notion. We don't always agree or like the laws of the state. But I want to begin here because this is an important principle in Jewish law. I then explained that our most interesting and powerful ethical dilemmas that we face today arise not when we have a single value in play, but when multiple values come into conflict. Anyone who attempts to frame a complex modern issue as a single value proposition should be treated perhaps with a bit of healthy skepticism. And indeed, there is another value in play. There were many. But we focused on one that shows up in this week's Parsha, is rooted in this week's Parsha, right? Ve'ahavta et hager. I shouldn't say it shows up. It is rooted in this. Love the ger, the stranger, the other, the foreigner, the immigrant, the alien, the migrant. For you were once gerim, strangers, in the land of Egypt. The implications of this commandment are beautifully articulated in the 13th century work on mitzvot, Sefer HaChinuch. We should learn from this precious commandment to have mercy on a person who is in a place that is neither the land of their birth or home of their ancestors, and we should not pass them by on the road when we find them alone. Since we find that in Torah, it warns us to have mercy on any who need help. And with these traits, it is we who receive merit and mercy from heaven, not them. It is Scripture hints at the reason for this commandment when it says, "For you were strangers in the land of Egypt." It reminds us that we once suffered this great pain that befalls anyone who sees themselves among foreign people in a foreign land. And remembering that deep worry of heart that this brings and that once befell us, our compassion for anyone in such a situation should overwhelm us. That's the 13th century. The commandment to love the ger is the most common commandment in the entire Torah. It appears 37 times. Its origin and justification lie squarely in the events of this week's Parsha, Va-eira. Why here? I've often thought it actually might be more appropriate to connect this commandment to Abraham, the original Jew who was in some ways the original ger, the original foreigner. After all, our introduction to him literally begins with the words, Lech lecha, right? Go forth from your land. But after thinking carefully over the past few days and reflecting on the experiences that we had and the experiences of those we encountered, I want to offer a new interpretation. And there's perhaps nothing new under the sun, but it's one I haven't found before. The reason that the idea of the ger and loving the ger is forever anchored in the story of Egypt is because the other idea we find in this week's Parsha, as well as the one before and after it, the idea of the Eved, one forced to toil, with few rights, little personal property, and whose sustenance and very method of enslavement is built upon a quota system of production. In other words, the text suggests that the stranger in our midst is often the most vulnerable to exploitation, to becoming a worker reduced to endless toil, to having to produce towards a quota day by day simply to survive in a cycle of alienation and subjugation, a stranger in a strange land. But there is, of course, an antidote. The value of haknasat orchim, the hospitality towards the stranger. It is hospitality that breaks this cycle And our tradition is pretty unambiguous about this too. As a matter of fact, we see in Talmud Shabbat, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, that Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, right? Gedolah, hachnasat orchin. Greater is the concept of welcoming the stranger, right? Mehakabalat penei shechina, than the reception of even the divine presence. Like many of you, I've been doing my best to follow the onslaught of news this week. And while I do not wish to ever speak about politics from the Bima, I do have strong things to say about our values. And so I want to use this position on the pulpit to say we must embrace our values of loving the stranger, hospitality to guests, and I hope we can do so in a way that does not run afoul of our other principle, that the law of the land is the law. I say this because there are 2 million people here in America who have shown up from countries all over the world, fleeing sometimes certain death or violence. I'm speaking of those who have legally claimed asylum, had their cases triple vetted by the Border Patrol, ICE, and then the humanitarian nonprofits here in America. We met some of them. Single mothers with few options on where to go, with no legal way to provide for themselves. It is a painful and unfortunate reality that the first thing most decent people do is nothing. I would like to suggest that we do differently. If you can host a young person seeking safety for a few months, please let me know. If you wish to help support the students from this trip, donate to a cause at one of the places they visited, please let me know. The great scholar Abraham Joshua Heschel says, "A Jew is not called to make a leap of faith, but rather a leap of action." This week of Parshat Va-eira, remembering both that we were strangers and slaves in the land of Egypt, I would like to invite us to act slightly differently. Shabbat Shalom.